A 14-year-old girl is standing in a hallway with a kitchen knife in her hand. On the other side of the bedroom door is her mother, Lana Turner, one of the most photographed faces in America, and the man threatening to kill her. Within minutes, that man, Johnny Stompanato, is dead. Within hours, the daughter's name is attached to his. And within days, a single act in a Beverly Hills hallway will follow that daughter for the rest of her life. Through a forced separation from her mother, through a decade of running, through a reinvention 3,000 miles from Hollywood, and all the way to her mother's deathbed 37 years later. A coroner's jury would clear her within 30 minutes. The press would call it self-defense. But the legal system's verdict and the actual cost of that night were never the same thing. And the gap between them is what this story is really about. This is the story of what April 4, 1958, actually cost Cheryl Crane, Lana Turner's only daughter. Not the night itself, the decades after it. This is The Gilded Woman. Subscribe it. The coroner's jury took less than 30 minutes to clear Cheryl of any wrongdoing. Justifiable homicide, they ruled. A daughter protecting her mother from a violent man. But a verdict answers what happened on one night. It does not answer the 15 years that built up to it, and it does not answer the 40 years that came after, when the cameras moved on and Cheryl Crane was left to actually live with what she'd done. To understand that hallway, you have to go back further than anyone usually does. You have to go back to a different child, a different tragedy, an entire generation before Cheryl was even born. Lana Turner was born Julia Jean Turner in Wallace, Idaho, in 1921, the daughter of a miner. She was 9 years old when her father, John Virgil Turner, was robbed and murdered after a craps game. His body found in an alley, his killer never identified. Her mother, Mildred, moved the family. Why from place to place afterward, taking work wherever she could find it. At one point sending young Lana to live temporarily with strangers while she scraped together enough stability to bring her back. By the time an MGM scout discovered 16-year-old Lana at a Sunset Boulevard cafe in 1937, she had already survived the sudden, violent loss of a parent and a childhood with no fixed address. It is not an explanation, but it is a pattern, and patterns in this family do not stay contained to one generation. Mildred rebuilt an entire household once before, around a child who had lost everything overnight. Decades later, she would be asked to do it again, this time for her granddaughter, under circumstances none of them could have predicted. MGM renamed her, restyled her, built an entire publicity machine around the sweater girl. Glamorous, available, endlessly photographed. The studio system Turner entered at 16 ran on a simple, unspoken rule. The contract came first, and everything else in a star's life reorganized itself around that fact. Pregnancies were scheduled around shooting calendars where possible. Marriages were managed for publicity value as much as personal happiness. Turner did not invent that system. She simply lived inside it for nearly 2 decades before her own daughter was old enough to start absorbing its consequences firsthand. The mechanics of that system are worth naming plainly, because they shaped everything that came after. Studio contracts of that era typically included morals clauses, controlled the timing of public appearances, and treated an actress's personal life as an asset to be managed alongside her films. Turner's early career was built, in large part, on a story the studio itself helped construct and circulate. The teenager discovered at a soda fountain, an origin story repeated so often in fan magazines that its exact details would later become difficult for historians to verify with full confidence. What's certain is that the studio's interest in Turner's image preceded and outlasted any interest in her well-being as a teenager navigating sudden fame, a dynamic that would repeat, in different form, inside her own household 2 decades later. She was 19 when Cheryl was born on July 25, 1943, the daughter of restaurateur Stephen Crane, a marriage already legally shaky from an earlier annulment. Crane's prior divorce hadn't been finalized when the two first married, forcing them to remarry in Mexico while Turner was already pregnant. The studio did not pause for any of it. Turner worked through her pregnancy and returned to filming within months, the same way every contract actress at MGM was expected to. Day-to-day care of the infant fell to nurses, household staff, and Turner's own mother, the same Mildred who had once rebuilt a household around a child who'd lost everything. Stephen Crane and Lana Turner divorced before Cheryl turned 1. It was the first of 8 marriages. Crane twice, bandleader Artie Shaw before him, a marriage that lasted only months in the early 1940s. Then millionaire Bob Topping, whose Bel Air estate dissolved by 1952 amid Turner's own accounts of his drinking and infidelity. Then actor Lex Barker. And here the story turns dark in a way no documentary should soften. In her 1988 memoir, Detour, Cheryl Crane wrote that Barker sexually abused her starting around age 10. An assault, she said, continued over a period of years inside her own mother's house. She said she eventually told her mother. Turner confronted him. The marriage ended in 1957. 3 sentences. They carry more weight than the rest of this script combined. After Barker came businessman Fred May, briefly, a marriage with almost no detailed historical record beyond its dates, swallowed quickly into the rhythm of arrivals and departures that had already become routine in the household. Then rancher Robert Eaton, married in 1965, divorced by 1969, by which point Cheryl had already left home, married, and built distance of her own. Then hairdresser Ronald Dante in 1969, a man who turned out to have a history of fraud. The marriage was annulled within months once the deception surfaced, the shortest of all 8, and reportedly the one Turner found hardest to live down in later interviews. What stayed constant through every one of those exits and entrances was Mildred's apartment. Small, modest, the one address that never changed hands in a divorce decree. Cheryl, by her own later account, kept 2 sets of belongings throughout her childhood. One for whichever house her mother currently lived in, one for her grandmother's. She rarely knew which bed she'd be sleeping in by the end of the month. The disclosure about Barker deserves its own moment here, separate from the list of marriages it interrupts. Cheryl wrote in Detour that the abuse began gradually, escalating over roughly 2 years before she found the words to tell her mother what was happening. She described the period leading up to that disclosure as one defined by confusion rather than clarity. A child trying to understand whether what was happening to her was normal, whether anyone would believe her if she said something, whether saying something would cost her the one parent she still had living under the same roof as her. When she finally told Turner, by her own account, her mother acted decisively, confronting Barker directly and ending the marriage. It is one of the few moments in the entire historical record where an adult in Cheryl's life responded to a disclosure of harm with immediate, unambiguous action rather than delay or doubt. That contrast matters for understanding what came next. By the time Stompanato entered the household the following year, Cheryl had already lived through one instance of a mother who, eventually, believed her and acted. It does not erase the years Cheryl spent unprotected before that disclosure. But it complicates any version of this story that paints Turner as simply absent or indifferent. By her teenage years, Cheryl had lived through 2 annulments, a string of stepfathers, multiple boarding schools, and at least one documented runaway attempt. An episode she later attributed not to any single incident, but to a feeling of not belonging anywhere, a feeling that had been building for years. School staff at the time described her as bright, withdrawn, prone to long silences broken by outbursts no one could predict. She was enrolled at the Sisters of Mary boarding school in 1957. That same year, her mother started seeing a man named Johnny Stompanato. It's worth pausing here on Mildred Turner, because she appears at nearly every hinge point in this story without ever becoming its central character. She was the constant through Cheryl's infancy, the address that didn't change with each new husband, the one who would later take legal custody after the inquest. Records and later interviews describe her as a steadying presence in a household that otherwise had very little structure to offer. A grandmother managing a teenager's day-to-day life while her own daughter managed a film career, a sequence of marriages, and eventually a homicide case, often simultaneously. She rarely appears in the period's tabloid coverage at all, despite arguably doing more sustained, uninterrupted caretaking for Cheryl than any other adult in the family across 2 full decades. Mildred had already lived through the sudden death of her own husband decades earlier, the same crime in a Wallace, Idaho, alley that had shaped young Lana's childhood. By the time she was asked to take custody of Cheryl in 1958, she was doing something she had effectively done once before, absorbing a child's crisis into her own household, rebuilding stability around someone else's catastrophe, without much public acknowledgement that this was, in fact, the second time she'd had to do it. Stompanato was a former U.S. Marine with documented ties to Los Angeles mobster Mickey Cohen. He and Turner kept the relationship largely private. Turner had just finished Peyton Place, the film that would earn her an Academy Award nomination, and a scandal could have undone the comeback in an instant. The relationship turned violent almost immediately. Household staff later testified, at the inquest and afterward, to witnessing repeated physical altercations between the two. Turner herself testified that Stompanato struck her more than once and threatened to disfigure or kill her if she tried to leave. She said she had tried to end things with him repeatedly, and that each time he refused to accept it. One attempt to leave took her across an ocean. Turner traveled to England in early 1958 to film Another Time, another place opposite a young Sean Connery. Stompanato followed her there uninvited, reportedly threatening Connery on set, before British authorities became involved and deported him back to the United States. A sequence confirmed by contemporaneous press coverage on both sides of the Atlantic. Turner came home and tried, again, to end it. Stompanato moved into her rented Beverly Hills house anyway, treating the breakup as a negotiation rather than a decision. Fear in that household was not an event. It was the weather. On the night of April 4th, Good Friday, 1958, Turner and Stompanato argued behind a closed bedroom door upstairs. Cheryl, 14, was elsewhere in the house. By her sworn inquest testimony, she heard his voice rise, heard threats aimed at her mother, and went downstairs to the kitchen. She came back with a knife. What happened next has never been disputed in its essential shape by either party. Stompanato was stabbed once. He died within minutes, despite attempts to get him help. This is the point where the documents stop agreeing with each other. Not on what happened. Both Turner's 1958 testimony and Cheryl's account written 3 decades later agree Cheryl acted to stop what she believed was an imminent threat to her mother's life. They diverge on smaller details. The exact words exchanged, how long the argument lasted before Cheryl moved, whether Turner asked her daughter to bring something up from the kitchen or whether Cheryl acted entirely on her own. Memory does that. So does grief. So does the particular kind of fame that turns a private kitchen drawer into courtroom evidence, examined under 100 photographers' flashbulbs. The coroner's inquest convened within days, drawing what newspapers called one of the largest press crowds Los Angeles had ever assembled for a public hearing. Some accounts describe reporters lining up outside before sunrise. Turner's testimony, tearful, composed, devastating, according to journalists present, laid out months of threats and violence. The jury deliberated under 30 minutes. Justifiable homicide. Contemporaneous accounts of that testimony are worth sitting with for a moment, because they reveal something about the strange position Turner occupied that week. She was, simultaneously, a mother testifying to save her daughter from a murder charge and a movie star whose every gesture on the witness stand was being assessed, in print, the way critics assessed her film performances. Several reporters present explicitly drew that comparison at the time, describing her testimony in language usually reserved for a review, weighing her credibility against her known skill as an actress, as though the two things could be cleanly separated under oath. It was, by any reasonable measure, an impossible position. Tell the truth about the worst night of your family's life while being publicly evaluated for whether you were performing that truth convincingly enough. Then the cameras packed up. The actual sentence began. Stompanato's associates did not consider the matter closed. Mickey Cohen publicly disputed the ruling, suggesting to reporters that the killing had been staged to protect Turner rather than Cheryl. He NT further, releasing private, intimate letters Turner had written to Stompanato during their relationship, handing them directly to the press in an apparent attempt to undercut the narrative that had cleared her daughter. The letters were reprinted across tabloids for weeks, used to suggest the relationship had been more affectionate, and therefore less purely abusive, than Turner's testimony implied. Cohen's campaign continued for months after the inquest closed, a sustained effort by a man with genuine organized crime connections to discredit the testimony of a grieving 14-year-old and her mother. None of it changed the legal outcome, but it placed a 14-year-old, a minor who had just killed a man to save her mother's life, at the center of an organized crime figure's public campaign to discredit that same mother. Stompanato's funeral in Woodville, Illinois, drew further coverage. Cohen reportedly attended in person and kept talking to reporters there too, repeating his doubts about the inquest's findings to anyone holding a notepad. Through all of it, Cheryl said almost nothing publicly. No interviews, no public statement beyond her sworn testimony. Every adult around her had a microphone. She didn't. A coroner's jury can clear a name. It cannot undo what a 14-year-old absorbed standing in that hallway, and the system that had just exonerated her did not return her to anything resembling an ordinary life. Within weeks, a juvenile court made Cheryl a ward of the state, transferring custody to her grandmother rather than her mother. Court filings from the period described the arrangement as probationary, requiring Cheryl to report regularly to juvenile authorities even while living under her grandmother's roof rather than in any form of institutional facility. The separation lasted roughly a year. Press coverage at the time called it protective, framing the arrangement as a gift of stability rather than what it also was. Another disruption lay. Aired on top of the one that had already upended her life days earlier. Cheryl, writing decades later, called it something else. One more decision made around her instead of with her. The latest entry in a pattern stretching back to infancy. She had just acted in self-defense of her mother's life. The system's response was to treat her, in her own words, less like a survivor and more like a problem requiring containment. Supervised, monitored, managed, rather than simply allowed to grieve. She has written about heavy drinking that began in her teenage years, continuing through more boarding school placements and at least one further runaway attempt. The tabloid shorthand had already calcified by then, the girl who killed her mother's boyfriend. A label that would follow her into adulthood no matter what she actually did with her life. Within a year of the inquest, fictionalized versions of the case had already begun circulating in pulp novels and film treatments loosely modeled on the events, none of which Cheryl had any say over or compensation from. The most consequential of these was a thinly veiled novel published in the years immediately following the case, whose plot closely mirrored the broad outlines of the Stompanato killing while changing the names involved. It sold well, was discussed in entertainment columns of the period, and added another layer to the story's life outside Cheryl's control. A fictional version of her family's worst night, available for purchase at newsstands, written by someone who had never spoken to her. She was, by the time she was old enough to legally buy a copy herself, already competing with an invented version of her own adolescence for the public's understanding of what had actually happened to her. She married at 19 in 1962 to a man named Joseph Takina. The marriage lasted roughly 4 years. The historical record offers little beyond the dates, a young woman trying, in the years right after the worst documented night of her childhood, to build something that looked ordinary. The years that followed the divorce are thinner still in the public record. Cheryl has described that stretch of her 20s, in later interviews, as a period of continued instability before anything resembling a settled adult life began to take shape. It's tempting, looking back across the entire arc of Cheryl's life, to draw a straight line from the inquest to the drinking to the early marriage to the eventual stability in Hawaii. Cause, effect, recovery in tidy sequence. The actual record resists that tidiness. The years between the Takina divorce and the move to Hawaii are not fully documented, and Cheryl herself has never offered a single clean narrative explaining exactly when or how the instability gave way to something steadier. What exists instead is a set of dated facts on either side of an undocumented gap. A troubled 20-something on one end, a successful business owner on the other, and very little public record of the work it took to get from one to the other. Whatever happened in between belongs to Cheryl alone, and the record's silence on it is, in its own way, a form of privacy she was never granted as a teenager. What Cheryl Crane did with the following 4 decades is the part most retellings skip entirely, because it refuses to behave like a tabloid arc. There's no second scandal waiting at the end of it. By the 1970s, she had relocated to Hawaii and entered real estate development, building a career with no overlap with the industry that had defined her entire childhood. The choice of location is hard to overstate. Geographically and culturally, it was about as far from the MGM backlit as a person could move while staying inside the United States. She built a development business on Hawaii's Big Island that operated for years. Acquaintances from the period describing her as practical, private about her business, and uninterested in discussing 1958 unless someone asked Dyer. CTLY. She kept her name off promotional materials when she could. She built relationships with local partners on the strength of her work, not her history, a deliberate inversion of the way her entire childhood had been shaped by a name that announced itself before she ever got the chance to. There is a particular kind of irony in a woman whose entire adolescence was defined by a name she never chose, building an adult career specifically structured around minimizing how often that name appeared on paperwork. It wasn't concealment, exactly. Cheryl never denied who she was when asked directly. It was something closer to a boundary, drawn deliberately, after years of having none. Where her childhood had offered no say over which house she lived in, which stepfather she answered to, or which version of her own story the public consumed that week, the Hawaii years gave her, for the first time, the ability to decide what got attached to her name and what didn't. The stability didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated, one project after another, 1 year without a relocation after another, until the accumulation itself became its own kind of proof that the old pattern had finally broken. She also, during this period, began living openly as herself. Cheryl came out publicly as a lesbian later in life, writing about it candidly in Detour at a time, the late 1980s, when that disclosure still carried real professional risk, for any public figure, regardless of how peripheral that figure's fame had become by then. It was a markedly different kind of risk than anything she'd faced as a teenager. The inquest had made her famous against her will, for something she'd had no choice about. Coming out was the opposite. A disclosure she controlled, made on her own terms, in her own book, years after she'd already built a life independent of the industry that once defined her. She entered a long-term relationship with a woman named Josh Leroy that lasted, by Cheryl's own account, until Leroy's death in 2002. Little detailed public record exists of the relationship's early years. Cheryl, consistent with her general approach to privacy during the Hawaii period, gave few interviews discussing it directly while Leroy was alive. What is documented is its duration. By any measure in the public record, it is the most stable relationship referenced anywhere in Cheryl's adult life, longer than any of her mother's 8 marriages, longer than the custody arrangement that once separated them, longer than the press coverage that once tried to define her entirely. That detail tends to disappear in retellings built around the knife. Because the easier story ends in April 1958, frozen at the inquest, a 14-year-old caught forever mid-testimony. The harder, truer story is the one where that same girl spent the next 4 decades building a life nobody had scripted for her. A career, a partnership that outlasted every marriage her mother ever entered, and eventually, a different kind of relationship with the mother she'd once been forced to save. That relationship didn't heal quickly. The record doesn't suggest it ever became simple, but it became something closer to reconciled. As Turner's health declined through the 1980s, it was Cheryl who increasingly managed her mother's care, medical appointments, household staff, the same press apparatus that had once turned her worst night into a national event, now circling back decades later for the final chapter. The role had shifted gradually over the preceding decade, according to interviews Cheryl gave around the time of her mother's death, moving from occasional visits to near-daily involvement as Turner's needs grew. Turner was diagnosed with throat cancer in the early 1990s. She died on June 29, 1995, at her Century City home, with Cheryl present. The daughter once legally removed from her mother's custody had become, by the end, the only person speaking for the family, fielding the same press inquiries that had once treated her as a minor footnote to her mother's career, now answering them as the family's primary voice. 3 years before that, in 1988, Cheryl published Detour, a Hollywood story, laying out the custody battle, the abuse by Barker, the drinking, the chain of stepfathers, and April 4, 1958, entirely in her own words, rather than the version assembled by a coroner's transcript and 3 decades of secondhand retelling. By accounts given around the book's release, Lana Turner read the manuscript before publication and disputed none of it. Not even the chapters describing her own absences, not even the chapter naming what Barker had done under her own roof. A mother who contests nothing in her daughter's account of her own childhood is making a statement, even in silence. To understand why that silence mattered, you have to understand what Lana Turner's public image actually was while Cheryl was growing up underneath it. Turner wasn't a minor figure absorbing a private tragedy out of view. She was, through the 1940s and into the 1950s, one of MGM's most bankable stars. The Postman Always Rings Twice, Cass Timberlane, a run of films built on the same composed glamour the studio had manufactured since she was 16. That image demanded constant performance on camera and off, leaving little public room for what was actually happening inside the house. Colleagues and biographers later described the gap directly. A studio-built Lana Turner on one side, a woman managing 8 marriages, a daughter, and eventually a homicide case on the other, all while keeping a filming schedule that rarely slowed down for any of it. Peyton Place had been released only months before Stampanato's death. Turner's Oscar nomination was announced the same season the inquest dominated headlines. 2 stories ran side by side in newspapers that spring. The actress nominated for the year's most prestigious award, and the mother whose daughter had just been cleared of homicide in the same household. 2 versions of the same woman, printed in adjoining columns, with almost no acknowledgement that they described the same person. Turner's career didn't end after 1958. If anything, the case kept her name circulating through years when contemporaries were aging out of leading roles. She worked through the 1960s and into television, including a recurring role on Falcon Crest in the 1980s that introduced her to an entirely new generation of viewers who had no memory of the 1958 case at all. Across nearly 6 decades, she remained one of the more durable names to come out of the studio system, a fact that sits uneasily next to what the record shows was actually happening behind it. Cheryl grew up inside both versions of her mother simultaneously. The polished, bankable one the public bought tickets for, and the unstable, occasionally dangerous one that existed at home. The distance between those 2 versions is, by Cheryl's own account, one of the defining facts of her childhood. Bigger than any single marriage, bigger even than the violence itself, because it meant she could never fully say what she was living through without contradicting the version of her mother the entire country believed in. There is no single villain in this story, and that's the harder thing to sit with than a clean answer would be. Stampanato is the easiest figure to blame, and the record supports that without much ambiguity. Court testimony, household staff accounts, and Turner's own sworn statements all describe a violent man in the months before his death. But the same documents describe a 14-year-old already sent away from home multiple times, already living inside a household rearranged by 8 marriages and a revolving cast of stepfathers, one of whom had abused her for years. A girl who picked up a kitchen knife not as an isolated reflex, but as the final beat in a rhythm of instability that had been building since infancy. Turner herself resists any simple scale. She was, by the record, a victim of Stampanato's violence. Bruised, threatened, followed across an ocean by a man she'd repeatedly tried to leave. She was also, by her own daughter's account, frequently absent during the years that mattered most. Slow to act on what Cheryl says she disclosed about Barker, though she did eventually act once told, ending that marriage rather than dismissing what her daughter had said. Both things are documented. Neither cancels the other out, and a documentary that picks only one paints a thinner picture than the record actually supports. The studio system itself rarely gets named in retellings of this case, but the record supports including it. MGM's contract structure, which prioritized a star schedule and image above nearly everything else, shaped Turner's adult life from the moment she was 16, almost exactly the age Cheryl would be when this same case made her a household name in her own right. A system that trained a teenager to put her career above her own stability produced 2 decades later, a household where a different teenager absorbed the consequences of that same priority, inherited not through any single decision but through the accumulated weight of an entire industry's expectations. It is, in that sense, a story about institutions as much as individuals. A studio that built a star out of a 16-year-old without much regard for what that would cost her later. A legal system that cleared a 14-year-old of homicide and then treated her like a liability anyway, and a press apparatus that found a teenager's worst night more valuable as content than as a private tragedy deserving privacy. None of those institutions held a knife. All of them, in their own way, helped put one within reach. The coroner's jury ruled on one night, could not rule on a childhood. The case left its own mark on how Hollywood scandal got covered going forward. A fact easy to lose from is distance. Legal historians and entertainment journalists have pointed to the Stampanato inquest as one of the earliest celebrity trials conducted almost entirely inside the modern media machine. Wire photographers, live radio updates from the courthouse steps, special afternoon newspaper editions built around testimony transcripts that hadn't even cooled before they hit the newsstands. The template set that spring. A private family tragedy converted within days into a national event with its own pacing and appetite, would repeat for decades, attached to other families and other children who never asked for any of it either. Cheryl Crane was among the first minors in American history to have her own legal defense of her mother narrated to a national audience in close to real time. Some legal scholars have pointed specifically to the speed of that 30-minute deliberation as its own artifact of the era. Fast enough to spare her a prolonged public trial, not fast enough to spare her the year of separation from her mother that followed regardless. The case is still occasionally cited in academic work examining how the American legal system handles minors at the center of homicide cases involving a parent, decades after the inquest itself wrapped. The comparison that recurs most often in later writing about the case is not to another celebrity scandal, but to ordinary domestic violence cases of the same era, households where a child intervened to protect a parent from an abusive partner, with none of the press attention, none of the inquest, none of the public record that exists for Cheryl. What made the Stompanato case different was never the underlying dynamic. Households where a partner's violence escalates until someone else in the home steps between it and its target are, unfortunately, not rare in any decade. What made this one different was the name attached to it, and the machinery of fame that turned a private, desperate moment into 6 decades of publicity. See retelling. None of which made it easier for the 14-year-old at the center of it. Precedent means something to historians. It meant considerably less to a girl trying to finish high school under a name every stranger in the country already recognized. A name that preceded her into every classroom and every new boarding school for years afterward. In the years since Detour was published, Cheryl has given relatively few interviews, and when she has, the conversation almost always circles back to April 1958 regardless of what she might actually want to discuss that day. She has, by multiple accounts, made a kind of peace with that reality without ever fully accepting it as fair. Granting occasional interviews around anniversaries of her mother's death, or when documentary projects approached her directly, while otherwise living a comparatively private life away from cameras, in keeping with the same instinct for privacy that defined her Hawaii years. Surviving footage and print interviews from these later appearances show a woman markedly different from the 14-year-old whose testimony once filled newspaper columns coast to coast, measured, controlled, willing to discuss the facts of 1958 without performing the emotion the tabloids once demanded from her. That composure itself is worth noting. It is, in its own way, the final piece of evidence in this story. A woman who spent her adolescence having her worst night narrated by other people learned, eventually, to narrate it herself on her own terms at her own pace, decades after anyone else got to choose the timing for her. What remains, underneath the inquest transcript and the memoir and the scattered interviews, is a simpler accounting than the tabloids ever offered. A girl was born into a household that moved too fast for her to ever fully settle into it. She lost any sense of permanence before she was old enough to know what permanence was supposed to feel like. She was abused by one of her mother's husbands and believed finally when she said so. At 14, she made a decision no child should have to make, and a coroner's jury agreed within half an hour that it was the right one. The state took her from her mother anyway. For a year, she drank, she ran, she married young, and it didn't last. And then, slowly, past the point where the tabloids were still paying attention, she built something that did last. A career 3,000 miles from the industry that raised her. A partnership that outlived every marriage her mother ever entered. And eventually, a mother she once saved with a kitchen knife, reconciled with by the end, cared for at the bedside instead of estranged from it. That is not the story the headlines told in the spring of 1958. It is, according to every document available 6 decades later, the truer one. Lana Turner's name still shows up on lists of the great studio-era faces, the sweater, the discovery story at the cafe, the run of films that helped build MGM's glamour machine. Her daughter's name shows up, when it shows up at all, mostly as a footnote to One Violent Night on Bedford Drive. But the fuller record, inquest transcripts, a memoir its subject didn't have to write, decades of business records from a development career on the far side of the Pacific, and the testimony of a relationship that outlasted every marriage either Turner woman ever entered, tells a different story than the footnote allows. What the footnote leaves out is everything that happened after the cameras lost interest. The boarding schools, the drinking that came before the discipline that eventually replaced it. The decade in Hawaii that nobody covered because nobody was watching anymore. The quiet, unglamorous accumulation of an ordinary, stable life, built specifically by someone who had every reason to believe that kind of life wasn't available to her. It is worth remembering, too, that almost none of this required Cheryl Crane to say anything at all. She could have stayed silent permanently, let the inquest transcript and Mickey Cohen's letters and the pulp novels stand as the only record anyone had of who she was. Instead, in 1988, she sat down and wrote her own account, naming the abuse, naming the instability, naming what the system did to her after it had already cleared her of any wrongdoing. And she did it while her mother was still alive to read it, knowing full well it might damage the fragile reconciliation they had only recently begun building. That choice, perhaps more than any single event in this story, is the clearest evidence available of who Cheryl Crane actually became, once she was finally the one telling it. It is the story of a girl who absorbed the worst that fame, instability, and one violent man's temper could produce, and who spent the rest of her documented life proving that none of it got the final word.